Hello, my name is Nick Farnell and I'm a professor in the School of Business at Niagara College. In this project, we'll cover some of the basic functionality in Excel that can be used to analyze data. This video should act as a refresher and assumes that you've already got a good working knowledge of Excel. Specifically, some of the things that we cover are how to import data, how to format it in a way that we can work with it, some of the common functions like sum if, average, average if, count, and max, and how to use pivot tables. Let's get started. To start out, I'd like to show you the finished version of our project. So we have a sheet called Jays 2015, which is all of the information about the Toronto Blue Jays regular season in 2015. We're going to bring this in from a website and then clean it up in a way that we can perform some different analysis on. We're going to create a summary sheet, and then we're going to use different functions to solve these. We're also going to create pivot tables, in this case a count of how many times the Blue Jays play each one of their opponents, as well as a pivot table showing how the average attendance differed at home depending on day of week. In this first section, we're just going to import the data from a website and bring it into Excel. So let's open Excel. And we're going to create a new blank workbook. Then we're going to go over to baseball reference. In this case, we're going to pull data from the Blue Jays 2015 schedule, and that's the data we're going to work with. Now, no data is ever perfect. In our case, there are some things we have to modify, and there are easier ways to bring data into Excel, but for this case, we're just going to pull something from a table on a website. So we can see there are 162 games in a regular season schedule, and that's what we're going to analyze here. We're just going to copy and paste. So if you click and drag all the way down, make sure you get everything. We can right click and copy, or Command C or Control C on a PC keyboard, and then we're going to go over here and in the first cell, A1, right click, paste special, and we're just going to paste it in as text. You can paste it in different ways, but then it's going to bring in some formatting, and right now we don't want that. So we have our information in Excel now, but you can see there's some funny things happening, like it copied in extra rows that we don't need, and that's just the extra headings from the website. The way they set up this website, they put an extra heading in certain parts of the page so you could see it if you weren't at the very top. Going back to Excel here, we have the everything pasted in. We're going to rename this sheet before we do anything, and I like to call this raw data. This is just the stuff that we've brought in. We haven't done anything to it yet, and I like to have this as a backup just in case you do something that you can't undo later on. You can always go back to this sheet and use it. So we're not actually going to do anything to this sheet. We're going to create a new sheet with the exact same content on it. To do that, we can right click, move or copy. So I'm just right clicking on the title that we changed, move or copy, and we're going to create a copy of the raw data sheet. Do that, you'll notice that you have raw data and raw data 2. We're going to rename raw data 2 to Jays 2015. It's helpful to name it something that makes sense, and this is the Blue Jays 2015 schedule. So now we have two sheets with the exact same stuff on it, just so we don't get confused and we don't go back to this unless we need this raw data. Again, I just like to have this in case we do something that we can't undo, then we already have the content that we're working on, but we don't need it right now, and hopefully we won't, so I'm just going to right click this, and we're going to hide that sheet. So it still exists, we haven't deleted it, we've just hidden it so that we don't get confused in using it. And that's the end of this section. In this section, we're going to format our sheet to make sure that everything is in a way where we can actually analyze it. So it's really important to become familiar with what you have here. So looking at, again, this is the 2015 Blue Jays baseball schedule, and this is historical, so this is looking back. The season's already happened. We have information about each game. Looking across the top, we have the game number, and if we go to the bottom, there's 162 games in the regular season. That makes sense. The date, so if we look at date, Monday, April 6th was the first game. That makes sense, but we're going to analyze this a little bit differently later, so we're going to have to break this apart. Date is in one cell right now. Column C is box score. That's not really useful to us. Team, TOR for Toronto. E doesn't have a heading, but this identifies whether it was a home game for Toronto or an away game for Toronto. So whether they played the game in Toronto or whether they played the game in the opponent's stadium. Opponent is the name of the team, New York Yankees, Baltimore, Tampa Bay. You can go back to Baseball Reference if you wanted to see what each one of those names were. WL is win-loss, so whether it was a win for the Blue Jays or a loss for the Blue Jays. Runs, that's runs for the Jays. RA is runs against the Blue Jays. Inning, default is 9. There's 9 innings in a regular baseball game. But there are some games that go past 9 innings if there's a tie. So in this case, this game went to 10 innings. Win-loss, it's showing up as a date. This is an error here. So when we pasted this into Excel, Excel saw this pattern and thought we were trying to put in a date. Excel tried to be helpful and change this format into a date. So for example, Toronto won the first game, so 1-0 would be their win-loss record. 1-0, Excel saw that and thought it was January 2000 and formatted it into a date. Thankfully, we don't need this win-loss column, so we're going to end up deleting that. Rank is the rank of the Jays in the division. Games back, that's just a way of measuring how far behind or how far ahead they are when it comes to a playoff spot. So looking at the second game of the season, they were half of a game ahead in the playoff race. A long time away from the playoffs. Win, which pitcher got the win. Loss, which pitcher got the loss. If you're not familiar with baseball, don't worry about that. And the save, if one of the pitchers saved the game. Again, if you're not familiar with baseball, don't worry about that part. Time, how long the game took. So this game took 2 hours and 59 minutes, 2 hours 56 minutes, 2 hours 52 minutes. DN, whether it was a day game or a night game. Attendance, how many people were at that stadium. Streak, a plus is 1 game win, a minus is 1 game loss, so 2 pluses, they were on a 2-game winning streak. And original schedule, if this was a replacement game from a rained out game or another canceled game. So now that we are familiar with what all of our columns are, everything makes sense other than this error in column K. We're not going to worry too much about that because we are actually just going to go out and delete column K. We don't need that for our analysis. We're also going to delete box score. We're going to delete that for our analysis. It doesn't add anything for us. If you're not sure if you need to delete something, you might need it later. Sometimes it's okay just to hide something. I don't think we're going to need the originally scheduled column, but rather than delete it, I'm going to right-click on the top of the column. So I'm going to right-click on the S, and I'm just going to click Hide. You'll notice that you don't see it anymore, but it's still there. And you can see that by the S isn't gone, but it's just not being shown. You can unhide things by clicking Unhide. Oops, make sure you highlight it. You click Unhide, but for us, we're going to hide this column. The next thing we're going to do is try to get rid of the extra rows that it added. So game, date, time, all of these throughout our table. They added those in the website just to make it easier to read the website. For us, not only is it not needed, it's actually going to hurt us, because if we tried to add up these columns, for example, it would give us an error if we were trying to add a letter inside numbers. So we can delete this row just by clicking on 170, then I'll right click, delete. We're going to delete row 165 as well. And as you can see, everything moves up once you've deleted a row. So this game 159, that row moved up into the column 165, or the row 165 that we just deleted. We're going to do that for the other ones as well. Make sure you're not deleting real content, you're only deleting these headings. So 109 we're going to delete, 83 we're going to delete, and I'm deleting from the bottom up. If you're deleting from the top down, then you're going to have different numbers as you go. We are going to leave the top one though, because that will be useful for us. I also like to resize the columns to make them a little bit more readable. So for example, date, you can't see the whole date in here. So if you hover over in between B and C, you can click and drag out so that the whole column is displayed. You can also double click that line and it will auto fit the column width. You can do it for the pictures as well, even though we're not going to be analyzing the pictures in this case. So I mentioned for date, we're going to analyze date a little bit differently. I'm going to insert a new column, actually on the other side, so I'm going to insert after date. I'm going to call this one weekday. I'm going to call this one month. I'm going to call this one day. The reason we're going to do this, in our analysis, we want to see if there's a pattern between what days of the week draw the most attendance, and we can split this apart, but right now the way this is put together, the day, month, and well, the weekday, the month, and date are all in the same column, but we want to break that apart later on. This column we mentioned is it identifies whether it's a home game or an away game for Toronto. It doesn't have a heading right now. We're going to call this home away. And then we can resize that so we can see the whole top. We're going to click on the first row, so click on the 1 beside the first row. And we're going to add filters. So if you go up to sort and filter, you can just click on filter. Again, I'm in the home part of the ribbon. Click on sort and filter, and then filter. And you can see here that once you've done that, it adds a little arrow in all of the top row. So what you can do with that arrow, you can sort things, you can filter things, but in this case we're just going to leave that for now. We are going to freeze the top row though, so you'll notice as you scroll down, you can't see what each column is. So is this runs for, is this number of innings, what is this? We can go back to the top and click on View, Freeze Panes, Freeze Top Row. So once you've done that, you can see that as you go down, that top row will always stay there. So before we do any further analysis, there's still a few things that we have to do to make sure that everything is ready to go. The first thing is breaking out the date to weekday, so we want the day of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in this column, the month, April, May, June in this column, and then the day of the month, so the number 6, 7, 8, 9 in this column. We also want to change home and away, so home and away is the column that shows whether Toronto was playing in their own stadium, so whether the game was played in Toronto or whether the game was played in the opponent's stadium. First we're going to go here and we can split this across. So again, we want weekday, month, and day in these columns here. We can select this entire column, go up to the data ribbon, and then text to columns. You can either click on fixed width if you have data that is a specific number of characters. In our case, we don't, but the pattern is the day of the week, a comma, a space, the month, the shortened month, a space, and then the day number. So if we click on delimited and then click next, if we have comma selected, then it will break at the comma. So you can see that Monday, April 6th, that line there is to indicate that it's going to put that in a new column. We also want to make sure that space is clicked so that after the month there's a new column as well. If we look down the list, everything looks pretty good until we get to June. So in June we have more than one game played in one day. Maybe this was a rainout or a doubleheader for some other reason, but that could give us an issue later on. So we're going to go back, we're going to cancel this out, and we'll create a new column. Oops. Create a new, insert new column. We'll call this game day num for now. This is going to get overwritten, but just so we know that this is the game day number. We can go back to this column, select the whole column, and we can go back to text to columns, delimited, click next, make sure that comma and space are selected, and then click finish. It's going to give us a little error here. In our case, we've already built these columns out. It's telling us that there's already data. It's actually going to overwrite our headings, but that's okay. We can change that later. We can click OK, and it gives us the day of the week, the month, the date number, and then the game day number was shown here. So our columns got a little bit messed up, but we can just rename these. So rather than date, we're going to call this weekday. Column C, we're going to call month. And this one we can call day number. We're going to delete column E and column F. We don't need those ones now. So we can delete those. The next thing we want to do is be able to quickly indicate whether this was a home game or an away game. So in our case, the way we can see this, we looked back at the data reference here, and if we hover over this, if we hover over it, tells us at means it's an away game, blank means it's a home game, which makes sense if you read this Toronto at New York. We're going to use the find and replace to change this to either say home or away. We could just go like this, type away in each one, but it would get really time consuming. So we're going to undo that just by clicking Control Z. If I highlight the whole row, I'm going to press Control F for find. We're not just going to find, we're going to replace. So if I click on replace, I'm going to find the at character, and I'm going to replace that with away. So I had already typed that, but I'll just type away. If I just clicked replace, it'll only do the first one. We're going to replace all. All done, made 81 replacements. Let's look here. We can close that for now. So everything that was the at is now replaced with away, and that looks good. For the blanks, so the home games, we could, again, we could type it out, but that would take way too long. We want to be more efficient than that. So there is nothing in here. There's nothing in these cells at all. We can still do a find and replace with that. So I'll press Control F, replace, find what? Find nothing. I have nothing in that cell, and I'm going to replace it with home. And I'll click replace all. Made 88 replacements. There we go. So now as we go down, we can see that it added a few more, so we don't actually need these cells. We can delete those just by clicking delete, or right click and then delete. And now we've replaced everything to have home and away, and we have the weekday, the month, and the day number. Let's just make sure this all looks right. We only have weekdays here, we only have the months, and there are no numbers greater than 31. Now we're ready to do some deeper analysis. So now that we have everything laid out the way we like it, we can start to do the analysis. So total game count, here we're just trying to count how many games they played in the regular season that year. If we go back to this sheet, we could just do it by number here, so we know that game number corresponds to what game they played. So they played 162 regular season games, but we want to make sure that we're doing this properly. You can also see that number 162 lines up on row 163. That's just because Excel counts this row as well. So our header row is actually row number 1, game number 1 is in row number 2, and so on. So we just want to use a function to be able to count how many games were played. Just like any other function, if you start typing equals, then you can either drop down from some common functions or just start typing the function and it'll autocomplete for you. So I know that we're going to do a count, so if I start typing count, we have a few different types of count. Count on its own just counts the number of cells that has numbers in it, where count A counts the number of cells that are not empty or have a number or a letter or something else in it. We're going to use count A, and really we can select any column on the other sheet. So if we go over to this sheet with this still open, and we're just going to use the team, and we're going to drag all the way down, make sure that you have everything here. So what you should see is count A, equal sign, count A, bracket, J's 2015 exclamation point. That just means it's a path to another sheet. We started typing this on the summary sheet, so this is just saying that apply the count A function on the sheet J's 2015 and apply it from E2, which is the first row in this column, all the way down to E163, which is the last row there. Then we'll finish it off with a bracket and click enter. That makes sense. We know that there are 162 games in the season, and this adds up. So we use count A to go to the other sheet, count everything that's not empty from E2 to E163. Home game count gets a little bit more difficult though. We only want to count the games that are at home. We can start it off the same way, typing equal count. We're not going to use count, we're not going to use count A, we're going to use count if. So counts the number of cells within a range that meet a given condition. So we'll double click on that, and you can see it gives us some options here. It gives us the range and the criteria. So we're going to count the number of games that satisfy the criteria of being at home. If we go back to this sheet with this still open, so we're going to go to J 2015, we're going to count in column F. I'm at the bottom of column F, so I'm just going to drag up all the way here just to there, so F2 to F163. You'll notice that range is still bolded, and then there's a comma after that. So that's the range that I want to count. And if I press comma, you can see it moves over to bold the criteria. So what's the criteria? Criteria is that it was a home game, or another way of looking at it is the word home is in this column. So because we're looking for a specific string or some characters, not numbers, put together, we're going to type in quotation mark and then HOME. We have to type it exactly the way it shows up here, and then we can close that with a bracket and press enter. And if we come back here, that makes sense. In Major League Baseball, they play half of their they play half of their regular season games at home, and that adds up. 81 games at home, 81 games away, for a total of 162 games. Everything's looking pretty good so far. The next thing we want to do is get the average game length. If we go over here, we have a column called time, and that's the length of the game, even though it tries to, Excel thinks it's a time of day, it's actually the length of the game. So if we go back to the summary, we're just going to use the average, so equals average, returns the average or the mean of arguments. So we can double click on average, and this one's really straightforward. With that still open, we're going to go back to this sheet, and we're going to average everything in this column. We're going to average everything from Q2 to Q163, close the bracket, and we're good there. So average game length of 2 hours and 53 minutes, that makes sense. Number of wins. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to count the number of wins in the win-loss column. So column H. It's important to review all of your cells and make sure that everything makes sense before you really jump into do an analysis like this. We would expect a W for win and an L for loss. That's obvious. But as you scroll down, you see W-WO, L-WO. In baseball, you can win with a walk-off or lose with a walk-off. It's just a different way of ending the game. If the game is tied, or if the team is down by 1 at their last at-bat, if they hit, or if they score 1 or more runs, there's no need to continue the game. This is just to indicate that. The reason it's important to review that is because if we just counted the number of W's in this column, it wouldn't give us an accurate number. We need to combine some functions to search for two things. We need to search for the number of W's and the number of W-WO's. So if we go over here to the summary, the number of wins, we're going to say equals count if, and the range here is H2 to H163. That's our range. The criteria is if it was a W, and that will count the number of regular wins. We also want to count the number of walk-offs, so you can just add a plus sign and do another count if. The same range. So I can drag all the way up, or I know that I'm going H2 to H163. Either way will work. Comma, and W dash, capital W dash, lowercase w, lowercase o. I'll close that quotation, close that bracket. So let's look at this for a second. We're saying count if on the J 2015 sheet from H2 to H163. Count if there's a W in there. Take that value and add it to count if on the J 2015 sheet from H2 to H163 if there's a W dash WO. So that will count the number of W's, count the number of W dash WO's, and add them together. So they had 93 wins that season. That's a combination of the wins and walk-off wins. Number of losses is the exact same thing, but rather than W's, we're searching for the L's. So count if. And again, I could highlight all the way up, or to save a little bit of time, I could say H2 to H163, and I'm searching for an L for loss, close that bracket. Also searching for a L walk-off, so from H2 to H163, and the criteria is L dash lowercase WO, so loss walk-off, and that will give me 69 losses. So that's 93 wins, 69 losses for a pretty good season. Winning percent is just the number of wins divided by the total number of games that they played. So we can we're not going to do a function here, we're just going to do some math in here, equal sign, then click on this cell. So we're going to divide B5 by B2. So forward slash is the division symbol, so B5 divided by B2 gives us 574. You might see more decimal places. You can go up here to number and change the decimal places. We want to see 3 decimal places. This is typically the way you'd see a winning percentage displayed in baseball. Total home attendance, so we want to know whether this team was able to draw a lot of fans, sell a lot of tickets. We don't care as much whether they were able to sell tickets on the road, because it's not their home fans. We want to know, were people coming to see them at home? So we're going to do a sum. So we're going to add things up. We type in sum. It's not just a regular sum, because we don't want the attendance of every single game. We only want the attendance of home games. So we're going to sum if. I'll double click on that. Oops. And we don't want that range. We want to go to our J's sheet and attendance all the way up. You'll see a blank cell here. Normally that would be unusual, but there was one away game that they played this season that actually had 0 fans because of some kind of local emergency in Baltimore. So that one is accurate, but it's important to review others. So J's, we're going to sum if on the J's sheet S2 to S163 is the range. Sorry, we're not going to do that. We're not going to base it on this range yet. You can see here we have the range criteria and the sum range. So the range that we're looking at is whether it was a home game or not. Then we're going to go to add it up. So the range is F2 to F163. Here we're trying to determine whether it was a home game or an away game. The criteria is home, and the sum range is attendance. So all the way from S2 to S163. And let's just take a look at this for a second. We're going to sum if. It's giving me an extra J's here. Sum if the sheet J's 2015 from F2 to F63 is home. So look at this column. If it's home, so for example line 156 is home, then add the attendance. If it's not home in this column, it won't count this game. So they had a total home attendance of 2,794,891 people. That's how many tickets they sold at home for the entire season. We also want to know, on average, how many tickets did they sell to an average game. So here we can use average, but not just a regular average. We're going to use average if, similar to what we just did with total home attendance. Click on average if. We have the range and the criteria, so identifying whether it's a home game or not, and then the range of what we're trying to average out. So if we go over to average home attendance, first we're trying to figure out whether it's a home game or not. So it's from F2 to F163. The criteria is F2, oops, sorry. The criteria is whether it was home or not. And again, it has to be typed the exact same way. Then the average range is this range here. S2 to S163. So on average, they had 34,504.82716 we can't have 82716 of a person, so we're just going to bring this back to 0 decimal places. Most runs for, this one's pretty straightforward. What was the highest number of runs they scored in a single game? We're going to go back to this sheet and we have a column called R for runs, and we're going to figure out which one of these games or which number is the highest in this column. So here we're going to start with the function called max, returns the largest value in a set of values. We're going to look for the maximum number in the runs column from I2 to I163. So they had at least one game where they scored 15 or more, 15 runs. Most runs against, exact same thing. We're going to use max again, but this time we're going to use this column. So RA is runs against. Again, I could drag up, but just to save a little bit of time, I know that J2 is the first in this row, so I can type that, and now we have this part of our summary complete. 162 games, 81 at home, average game length of 2 hours and 53 minutes, 93 wins, 69 losses, winning percent of 574, total home attendance of 2,794,891. On average, they sold 34,505 tickets to their home games. Most runs for was 15, most runs against was 13. We've completed the summary. Now there are two other things that we want to calculate, and we're going to go about it a little bit of a different way. Next, we want to calculate how many times the Jays played each one of their opponents, and we want to calculate the average home attendance by weekday. So was there more tickets sold on average on Saturdays versus Wednesdays? We're going to try to figure that out. So we're going to go back to the Jays 2015 sheet, and we're going to create a pivot table. We go up to Insert, click on Pivot Table. It'll bring up a new window with a few options. Select Table Arrange, Jays 2015 A1 to U163. That's right, that's the entire table that we're working with here. And where do you want the pivot table to be placed? We want to put it on a new worksheet. We don't want that pivot table overlapping what we have right here. So we can click OK, and it's created a new sheet for us with some fields here, and gives us a note here that says to build a report, choose fields from the pivot table field list. So first we're going to count the opponents. You can see here that each one of these lines corresponds to the headings in our previous table. So we want to take opponent, which is labeled OPP here, and we're going to click and drag it into rows. So as soon as you do that, you can see that it's populated all of column A here with the row labels of the opponent names. So Atlanta, Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, and so on. It doesn't tell us yet how many times they've played each team, and that's what we're trying to figure out. So we can click on opponent again and drag it down into values. And you can see here there's a drop down that says count of. So it's count of opponent, and that's what we want. So count of opponent, they played Atlanta 6 times, they played Baltimore 19 times, Boston 19 times. All of that makes sense. So they played 162 games, and these are the teams that they played this year. This is how many times they played each one of these teams. We're done with this. We're just going to change the name of this sheet. We'll call it opponent. And we'll go back to our Jays 2015 sheet, and we're going to create another pivot table. So we're going to try to figure out the average attendance by day of week. We're going to insert pivot table again, A1 to 163, U163, we're good there, in a new worksheet. And here we're going to list average attendance by day of week. We could, for example, do this by a series of functions. to say if day of week is Monday and home away is home, then count the attendance and average it. Sum the attendance and average it by the number of games. That's a lot of work, that's a lot of functions, a lot could go wrong there. Using a pivot table for something like this is way simpler and a lot quicker. So to do that, we have our new pivot table created. It's created a new sheet for us as well. We're going to click on weekday first, and we're going to drag that into rows. This makes sense. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Next, we're going to get the attendance and drag it to values. So if we scroll down to attendance, click and drag and bring it to values, now we have count of attendance, but this doesn't really make a lot of sense. 26 on Sunday, there was definitely more than 26 people that came to the game. What this is doing, it's counting how many times there was a Sunday and attendance was greater than 0. So there's 26 Sundays where they sold tickets to at a home game or an away game. We don't want count of attendance. We can click on this and click on value field settings. We want average attendance, and then we can click OK. This makes a little bit more sense. So on average on Sundays, attendance was 37,370. If we look at Wednesdays, for example, 27,876. That makes sense. Midweek games, difficult to get people out to. We're still not done yet because this counts everything. This counts attendance for home games and away games, but we can use a filter to filter that out. If we go up to home away, we can click and drag, and now we have a filter that says home away. Right now it's on all. We can click away, and that will show average attendance on these days of the week for an away game, but we want home game. So we can click on home, and this will show us average attendance for home games by day of week. Looking at this quickly, that makes sense. Sunday games are typically in the afternoon at home in Toronto, and they draw bigger crowds. Finally, we're just going to change this to the name of the sheet to weekday attendance. We're going to move this around a little bit. I'm just going to drag the J's sheet to the front, and actually I'll drag summary in front of that. And then we're just going to make this summary table, we're going to change the visuals just a little bit. We're going to highlight this top row, and we'll change the background just so we can distinguish that this is a header. Why don't we make it a blue color, and we'll change that text to bold, and maybe make it a little bit larger. So we have everything complete now. We've created our summary. We have all of our functions. We've created our sheet from the very beginning. We've also done 2 pivot tables with a count of opponent and an average of home attendance based on day of week. To recap, we imported data into Excel. We copied from the Baseball Reference website showing the 2015 Blue Jays season. We revised this and cleaned it up so we could perform our analysis easily. We created a summary sheet and used different functions to solve these results. We created 1 pivot table showing how many times the Jays played each one of their opponents, and then a 2nd pivot table showing the average attendance depending on day of week at home. I hope you found this useful.